don't know how you feel about these video shoots outdoors, but I love being outside. Even when it's a colder day like today, anytime I can bring along gear and film a video outdoors, I'm going to do so. Now today I've got my Hardland winter jacket on, and I love this jacket because there's a little bit of a wind at times and it's kind of damp out here. And this jacket keeps all of that out. If you haven't heard of Hardland before, I really like their gear. I've linked to their website in the description below. If you're looking for some great outdoor gear, I definitely encourage you to check them out. So today's video is all about ND filters and the DJI Osmo Action 3. I absolutely love using ND filters on cameras as much as possible. Now it's great to not have to need them, but most of the time if you're filming outdoors in a lighting situation like this, where there's sun and it's the middle of the day, if you want to have a certain look to your footage, you have to use the ND filters on your camera. For instance, this camera I'm talking to right now, I have a big ND filter on that lens, 82 millimeters to be exact, because that is the size of the end of the lens. And what that ND filter allows me to do is it allows me to keep my shutter speed at twice my frame rate. That's also known as the 180-degree rule. So you might ask, okay, why do I want my shutter twice my frame rate? Well, having the shutter twice the frame rate helps keep your motion natural looking. So when I move my hand here, you can see motion blur. And that's how the human eye sees motion. The human eye does not see every single frame sharply like this. And a lot of times when you're using action cameras, it can be easy to get footage that looks that way, because a lot of action cameras are going to bump up that shutter speed. That shutter speed is going to be like 1/120th, 1/240th, 1/480th. When you do that, the footage is not smooth looking and it doesn't have that motion blur. Every frame is really sharp. And while that's great for using things like electronic image stabilization, it doesn't look natural to the human eye. But when you put an ND filter on your action camera, or any camera for that matter, the motion blur is there and it looks a lot more natural and feels a lot more natural. So when your audience is seeing your video, it's going to look a lot better to them. They're going to like how it looks versus footage that has that sharpness to every single frame. So today's lighting, speaking of ND filters, is a little bit tricky because the sun is in and out of clouds. So the ND filter that I have on this camera I'm talking to, it is adjustable. It's a variable ND filter. The ND filters I'm going to show you today, there are different numbers on them where you can adjust them based on your lighting. If I step back into the shadow here, my lighting's a little more even. Big old tree up here blocking the sun, but that's not going to last the whole time. So obviously the first thing you need to do is you need to know where to get ND filters. So the ND filters that I use are these ones right here from FREEWELL. These are the Bright Day Pack. These also have the polarizer on them. Now, if you don't know what a polarizer is, the polarizer is great on bright sunny days like this because it helps filter out some of that lighting from the sun that can make your footage look washed out in white. It helps keep the blue of the sky deep blue, and it helps with some of those cloud details as well. So I like it that FREEWELL has built the ND and the polarizer into the same filter, so you can have the best of both worlds at the same time. Now, FREEWELL makes a lot of filters, and they are my favorite brand. They also make filters that are a polarizer where it's not ND. So even if you want a filter to put on your Osmo Action 3 where you don't need the ND, but you still want the polarizer capabilities on a bright day, it'll still make your footage look better, and you can get one of those as well. I've linked to these filters in the description below, and I've linked to all of the ones I own from FREEWELL so that you can check them out. Now we're going to talk about the what. So ND filters help filter out some of the brightness of the sunlight, and that's what makes it possible for you to do the shutter speed at twice the frame rate. If you didn't have an ND filter on and you did a shutter speed twice the frame rate, your footage would be almost entirely white and it would be way overexposed. And that's because there are three main things that affect the exposure of your footage. The first one is aperture. So the Osmo Action 3 has a static aperture of f2.8. And what that means is that's a constant aperture on this camera. You cannot change it. And that affects your depth of field, but it also affects how wide open the camera is. So it affects how much light gets into your camera to hit the sensor. f2.8 allows a pretty good bit of light into there. The second setting that affects the exposure of your footage is the ISO. So what you could do on this camera, if your footage was too bright, you could bump the ISO all the way to 100 and set it at that. But on a bright sunny day, even if you do that with double the shutter speed, it's still going to be overexposed and too white. And the third thing that affects the exposure of your footage is the shutter speed. So with this camera, if you were to leave the shutter set to auto, this camera, it would have that static f2.8 aperture, it would bump the ISO down to 100, and then it would bump the shutter speed way, way up to properly expose the footage. And that defeats the whole purpose of what we're trying to do. We want that shutter speed set to 1/50 if you're doing 24 or 25 frames per second. If you're doing 30 frames per second, you'd want the shutter speed set to 1/60. If you're doing 60 frames per second, you would want the shutter speed set to 1/120. So now that we've talked about the what, let's get into the how. So I'm going to mount this on a tripod so that I can demonstrate how to install the ND filter, and then I'm going to run through some settings that you need to change when you're using the ND filter. All right, so first thing we need to do is we need to get the ND filter mounted on here. So for today's lighting conditions, where it's sunny and cloudy and the sun's not too high in the sky, I'm going to select ND16. Now, if it's a really bright and sunny day, I'm going to need ND32 or ND64. And if it's a cloudy day, or if it's getting close to sunset or it's close to sunrise, then ND8 is often going to be all I need. So let's get ND16 out and we'll pop that on. First thing we need to do here is we need to take the lens off the DJI Osmo Action 3. Now DJI makes this really easy to do. They include this rubber piece here around the lens, but I don't typically use that. I like to take the rubber off and grip the actual metal on the lens, but that rubber piece is supposed to be for getting a better grip with taking off this lens cap and putting it back on. But I find I just like to use it without the rubber. But all you have to do here is you turn counterclockwise, and this is going to screw off. And you do have to rotate this quite a few times to get it off. So now that we have the lens cover off, we're going to put the ND filter on. I like to put the lens cover that came with the Action 3 back in the case in order to protect it. That way I don't lose it, it doesn't get scratched, it doesn't get damaged. I put it right in the place where my filter came out. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to line it up, and I'm going to turn it to the right or clockwise to tighten it on. And I want to keep turning this until it's all the way attached. And once I have it on, it won't turn any further, it'll be tight. And by the way, this outer part here is how you can adjust the polarizing feature of this. So if you turn it one way, it's going to intensify the polarizing of it. And if you turn it the other way, it's going to weaken the polarizing. The easiest way to tell that is to put your camera toward the sky if there's any blue. And the deeper the blue gets, that's more of the polarization effect. The lighter the blue gets, that's less of the polarization effect. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the settings that you need to adjust when you're using the ND filter. So I'm going to rotate the camera around here, and I'm going to power it on, and we're going to take a look. All right, so first thing we want to do right away is we want to click down here at the bottom. And I personally like to use 4K 4:3 because it gives me some extra footage so I can do some of this and change some of the vertical and horizontal framing of the shot. But if you don't want that, you can do 4K 16:9. For the purpose of filming this, it does not matter which one you select. Either one will work just fine. But I'm going to keep it the 4:3, my preference. And then we're going to go over here to the left, and I'm going to set this to 24 frames per second because I'm in the United States, and that is the NTSC standard. Now, if you're in a different country, you might have the PAL standard, the PAL, and in your country, you would probably want to use 25 for this. It's not going to affect the shutter speed setting if you use 24 or 25. That same option is going to apply, but in this case, I'm going to use 24. So now that we've adjusted that, we're going to swipe down, and then we're going to go to the other menu to do a few more adjustments here. So we're going to click on this right here on the right, and it's going to bring up the advanced settings. So first thing you want to make sure is you want to make sure Pro is turned on up here at the top, because these settings are going to be found under that Pro mode, and if it's not turned on, you won't see these options. So first thing we got to do here, click on exposure, and you need to click on M. And what you need to do after clicking on M, M stands for manual, and you're going to swipe up here. You're going to select 1/50. 1/50 is twice our frame rate. Technically 1/48 is, but 1/48 is not offered on a lot of cameras. We're going to click confirm after you do that. And then what we're going to do next is we're going to go over here to ISO. We want to set a range that the camera can use. So in a way, this is like setting ISO to auto, but I like to restrict the range. So what I want to do here is I want to select 100, to 800. And basically what this does is it gives the Action 3 the ability to adjust the ISO anywhere between 100 and 800, depending on lighting conditions. So you can see the number up here. It's currently at 370. That's what the camera has selected as the best way to properly expose that footage. And next, we're gonna click confirm down here. Since it is daytime, I wanna have my white balance on 5000K. I'm gonna keep that there. You could also do auto white balance if you want to. The Action 3 does a pretty good job with deciding that. So the other thing I like to do for this is you can do color normal, or you can do D-Cine-like, which has the 10-bit option. I like to do D-Cine-like because I like to grade that footage later on, and D-Cine-like has the most detail there for me to really bring out. So I'm gonna do D-Cine-like 10-bit, but you can do normal if you don't want to do grading later on. That's fine too. That will not affect the cinematic motion blur aspect. And the field of view here will not either. I like to use the standard D-warp because that has the lines that look good. It doesn't have that wide fisheye effect. But again, whatever you set here is fine. You can do ultra wide, wide, or standard D-warp, and it's not going to affect the motion blur. And then finally, there's one other thing that we need to adjust, which is really important when using ND filters. And that is rock steady. So rock steady has to be off. And the reason for that is the electronic image stabilization that Rocksteady uses. It does not work well when you have a lower shutter speed. And that's because the EIS needs those sharp individual frames to properly stabilize the footage. When you're at 1/50 for your shutter speed, those frames are not sharp. There's that smooth cinematic motion blur in between each of those frames, and the EIS freaks out. It doesn't work properly. So you end up with footage that looks very jittery and, in my opinion, is unusable. So it's really important that you turn Rocksteady off. Which, by the way, you get back some of your crop that you lose when Rocksteady's on. When you turn it off, you get back more of your scene there, which I like. But I know what you're probably gonna ask. If my Rocksteady's off, then what happens to the stabilization of my footage? Isn't it gonna be really shaky and unusable because of that too? Yes, it will be, unless you use a mechanical gimbal. So you have to use a gimbal with the Rocksteady off. Unfortunately, the Osmo Action 3 does not have built-in gyroscope data as of the time of me filming this video. Hopefully DJI will add that later on. They did add that eventually with the previous Osmo Actions, and hopefully they will with the 3 as well, because that is super useful, because you can film without a gimbal and Rocksteady off, and then you can stabilize that footage in post-production. A lot of other action camera brands like GoPro and Insta360, those have that gyroscope data, and you can easily stabilize when editing. But because this does not, you absolutely have to use a gimbal. Otherwise, that footage will look really bad even if you try to stabilize it. So the gimbal that I use for the sample footage I'm showing you today is the Moza Mini P. And I really like that gimbal with the Action 3. The stabilization is better than some of the cheaper gimbals, and I feel like it did a really good job today. I was running with that gimbal a lot when I was filming that sample footage, and it still looked great. So now that those settings have been adjusted, you are ready to go. You're ready to pop on those ND filters and get out there and film. And I'm going to provide some additional sample footage so that you can see really what this motion blur looks like. So that is the why, the what, and the how of using ND filters on the DJI Osmo Action 3. If you want to up your Action 3 game, I definitely encourage you to try out ND filters. They're a lot of fun, and they work really well on this camera. In my opinion, it makes the footage look like it didn't come from an action camera. It makes that footage look a lot better.